My name is Mollie Vaughan and I'm based in Bells Beach. My works often look at how science and art come together, and I do this using both analogue and digital photographic processes. And we can see my work on the right there, Fibonacci, and you'll see this later on in the presentation. So this workshop is all about how to photograph our artwork using your smartphone. I am aware, though, that there are some who would like to learn a little bit more about DSLR camera work. So if you do have any questions specifically about DSLR or the larger digital cameras, if you could just leave any questions in the chat box, as Stacey mentioned, or if you have any questions, again, I have my T-Station chat on Friday at 2:30. Throughout this presentation, we'll be going through a little bit about why photographing our artwork is important. It also was made quite clear that a few of you may be a little bit concerned about copyright stuff in terms of when posting images online and on social media in particular. So I will be going through that extensively. And as well as that, we'll be looking at positioning of artwork when photographing, and also to most fundamentally lighting. So when we look at photography, photography literally means to write or to draw with light. And so because of that, it is a major part and major consideration when we are photographing any artwork. And finally, we'll be looking at some basic editing on our smartphone. But the same principles in terms of lighting and positioning of work all apply across all different cameras. So without further ado, let's start the workshop. Oh no, why is this not? Stacey, it's not working. I'm not able to hang on one moment. Apologies, everyone. We always get technical difficulties. Let me just see.
Yeah, sorry, Mollie, I can't help.
That's all right. Hey.
Again.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent.
Just showing off my technical grandeur there. Okay, so before we go on to all the technical elements when photographing our artwork, we need to understand why it's important. And as that little bit of writing on the right of the screen there says, a good photograph equals more likely to sell. So most of you will be looking to photograph your work for a commercial basis. Not all of you, and we will get to some other uses of our images of our work in the next slide. But when we're looking at photographing work in order for a kind of commercial context, it's really important, and I would recommend to you all, you actually get to know who your buyer is, your demographic, your clientele, etc. And this is important, and this is where we get on to my kind of scientific brain here. But as artists, we readily use our creative brain, and what tends to happen is it creates a more readily available lateral thinking process within an artist's brain. Now, we can assume that most of the people wanting to buy your work are perhaps not artists themselves, and therefore they're not using this creative brain as much. And when we look at lateral thinking, it essentially means that we're able to visualize the physical work, even if the photograph doesn't accurately present that work. So when we are looking at photographing in order to sell work, much like how I'm sure we've all had experiences when buying things online, we might have had a product that we were really interested in, which looked really good in the photograph, but wasn't accurate a representation of what the actual object or product that we bought came to be in the end. So it's really important, and you'll hear me say this throughout the presentation, that the aim when photographing our artwork, whether it be two-dimensional or three-dimensional, is all about accurately portraying the physical work within its digital format, i.e. the photograph of itself. And the other important thing to note too is that your work actually reflects you as an artist. Now, there are a few of you here who are perhaps hobbyists or consider yourselves hobbyists. Know that when we're photographing our work to a high quality standard, this is not a reflection of how professional you are. It actually looks more at how passionate you are about your practice. And these are all of the subliminal kind of messages that perhaps not obvious at the start, but when you are a client interested in one of your works, these are all the kind of subconscious things that start to occur. So we can kind of look at this in the perspective of if you have a lower quality image or portrayal of your work in its digital format. There can be messages to the client's brain kind of looking at this as, well, if they can't even take the time to really meticulously focus on representing the work, then what does this say about the artist's practice? And so again, I will reiterate that this is a reflection of how passionate you are about not just your practice, but also that particular work, rather than whether you're a professional or not. So it's very important that we look at how we're presenting ourselves through photographs of our work. Other uses for artwork imagery are social media. Now, this is obviously going to be really important during the arts trail. You would have, for those who went to Sabrina's workshop last week, I think she briefly may have mentioned things about the computer algorithms of social media platforms. Essentially what happens is when you post an image to social media, whether it be Facebook or Instagram, the computer algorithm that rules those social media platforms kind of scans the image, if you will, and looks at whether it is a low resolution image, whether it's been taken with some blur, whether the colors are muted or desaturated, all those different things. And if it's a lower resolution image or lower quality image, it will actually send your image to the bottom of people's feeds, so people who follow you, and meaning then that less people are actually able to see your work. So it is very important in this circumstance as well that we really think about creating high quality imagery, because the better quality your images are, the more engaging the content as is seen through those ruling computer algorithms. The second point there, looking at providing images for our grant applications or for other such applications. This could be, you might want to apply for an exhibition space in a gallery. Now we start looking at just how important it is to photograph your work in a high quality way when looking at also how it reflects upon organisations. So all grant review bodies, all galleries will have a standard whereby you need to be providing high resolution images when applying for these different things. And this is because now you're not just representing yourself as an artist, but you're also representing the organisation or the gallery space, what have you. And finally, we can use images for promotional materials such as press releases, mainstream media, print media, or images for your website if you have one. Okay. Image copyright. Last week when Nat Martin, she presented her workshop, there were a few concerns from people about ownership of images. And I just want to let you all know and draw your attention to this. So Copyright Act of Australia is 1970 is essentially a copyright law that says that all intellectual property, so that's your artwork, photographs of your artwork, also things like your folio, if you have one, any sketches or preliminary processes that then talk about the build-up and evolution of the final work. They are all owned by you. No one else owns your artwork. You are the person that brought that artwork into being. And because of that, you own your artwork. No ifs, no buts. And if anyone tells you differently, you can send them my way and I'll sort them out for you. I've had a few people already have these issues, and it's definitely not a process that you want to try and fight because it costs a lot of money. But know that you absolutely own your artwork. what we see with social media platforms is they have a sub-license of your image. Typically, when we're looking at licensing of images, it's quite a common term for any photographers out watching this now. I'm sure we are aware of this. So licensing really looks at partial ownership, but only for a certain period of time and under strict conditions that you as the artist have written up in a kind of contract. So you might have you might go to a third party and say, okay, well, you can have ownership of this image for this 1 month on only this website using all acknowledgements as me as the artist of the work, etc. And what tends to happen with Facebook and Instagram in particular is the reason why they ask you under the terms and conditions to give them rights for a sub-license of your images is because they need to duplicate and disperse any images in terms of archiving for things like security purposes. So just say, you know, we have a terrorism act happening in Australia and they need to figure out where this was being promoted on social media, etc. Not that I expect any of your work to be used in such a manner, but this is why they need to be archiving and making copies of each and every photograph or video that's posted to Facebook or Instagram. You will also from time to time see people using watermarks, so either like a digital signatory or a little C in the circle, and it's kind of a lower opacity and they've watermarked the image. But know that you don't need to include this for it to be, for your work, anything that you posted, to be covered under copyright law. One thing that we can do, practically speaking, is keeping our photographs under 72 ppi, meaning pixels per inch. This refers to your photograph's resolution. For those who are interested in DSLRs, this changes a little bit, but essentially this is all done for you on your smartphone. All photographs taken on your smartphone are already at 72 ppi, which just means that if someone does steal your work, that they aren't able to reproduce it in print form because it's too low a resolution. Okay. So going on to now the technical aspects of our work, we're going to start first with positioning of our work. We will get on to three-dimensional works a little bit later in the workshop, but for now I'm just going to concentrate on the two-dimensional work. So as we can see in that left image, I photographed this artwork on a neutral background, so ideally it should be white. However, if to say you have certain colours and shapes in your works that you think would be complemented best with black or grey, then that is fine as well, but ideally it should be white. And particularly when we're looking at framed works, not so much for canvases, we want to be making sure that we're not including the frame when photographing. The only reason why you should include the frame is perhaps if you want to make sure that it is aligned correctly. So if we're looking at the frame edge here, we can clearly see that it is on a very warped angle and it is not linear to the frame of the actual photograph. So it's a good way and makes it a lot easier to make sure that we have photographed the work straight on, so that there are no warped angles going on. We can also see that it's slightly off center on the image on the left there. We can see there's more space on one side than there is another. So making sure that, again, everything is centered within the photograph is really important. If we look to the image on the right, we can see why it's important to photograph on a neutral background, and that is because all the clutter in the background detracts from the work itself, and it also makes it a lot harder, I should say, to try and align your work so that it is straight on and linear. One of the things too with the image on the left that we can see is that there's also a reflection there. We definitely don't want to have that. These are just little things to kind of note when you are photographing your work, just to make sure that everything is of a high quality standard. So just a bit of a summary, and I've just on the right there, this is just a very, very basic setup of what you can do at home. So I've just gotten a very large white towel, and ideally what you should be doing is bringing that neutral colour, whether it be white, black or grey, and you should be bringing it behind the work and then underneath it. So we can see how I've wrapped the towel underneath the work as well. Ideally, you should be using paper rather than a towel. I didn't have any long sheet of paper because we don't want to have any texture in the background. Again, it just detracts from the work. Making sure that, as I said before, that our work is being photographed straight on. Also that it is centered in the photograph, and also do not lie your artwork flat on the ground, unless of course it's not able to support itself, or it can't remain straight. So typically I think of a lot of paper-based work, so watercolors or sketches, etc. But still within that, it should essentially look like it has been photographed with it, standing vertically rather than flat. Making sure that within the neutral background there is no clutter happening, so that we can't detract from the work itself, and so that again we can make it a lot easier to realign the work. And background colours should be either white, black or grey, and other materials are paper or fabric if this isn't possible at all. Just as long as you maintain that what is behind the work is a neutral colour, then that is completely fine. Okay. Now going on to the most important aspect when photographing artwork. As I said before, when we look at anything to do with photography, light is so, so important. And one of the more important parts is white balance. And this refers to the color correction abilities of most modern cameras. And it works by correcting the temperature or the color of the light being cast on our artworks. So we can see in Van Gogh's image that I've taken here, we can see on the left here, we have a really orange light being cast. And this is from overhead LEDs like I have above my head now. In the middle, this is what we call neutral light. And you can only get this by photographing in natural light. As we can see on the right, I'm using a flash, and that creates too cool a light. Other kind of lights that cause really cool or too blue a light could be things like fluorescent lighting as well. But essentially, we should not be photographing in artificial light. It's really important when looking at light on our work that we have a really lovely even spread, that it's diffused light, so it's not direct. And also, most importantly, like what I said at the very start, we want to be photographing our work so that it is a digital representation of the physical work. And all of these colours we can see on the strip on the left and the right, they are introduced colours, and we don't want to have that. So making sure that we are always photographing in natural light, particularly with two-dimensional works, is vital when looking at how we're looking at light and in relation to our artworks. Just making sure that when photographing our work that we choose a light that gives a true representation of the colours and the shapes and the tones within that artwork. Other more technical aspects of lighting in terms of the position of light that we need to be aware of. Do not photograph your artwork from behind. It creates glare, as we can see in that image on the left there. And also what can happen, and this is particularly so for framed works under glass, is that if the light is reflecting on from behind, it means that you're getting cast with light, and then that is able to reflect in the actual artwork itself, which we can see in my little hand. And I'm pretty sure I wasn't born at the time of Van Gogh, so I'm definitely not part of that artwork. So we definitely don't want to have any reflections or glare in our artworks. That image in the middle, this is why it's important to make sure that we're using indirect natural light. So what we're seeing in the middle there is direct light that has been cast onto the work. And it's created some very strong contrast of shadows. And we can also see within the shadowy areas, and this is important too when we look at Most importantly, when you are photographing your work, you should be in a very light and bright spot. So if you have too little light, as we can see there, you do get colours which then become muted because they don't have any light on them. And the camera cannot discern between light and dark. It doesn't like having such a strong contrast. And then, of course, on the right, artificial light, a big no-no. Again, it changes the colour of the work, but also we can see that you can actually see the reflections and glare of the actual lights themselves, which can often happen. So when we look at setting up our artwork, it's really important to remember two basic things. We need to look at, one, where is our light source coming from? So always note when you're positioning your work, whether it be outside or in the house, you need to be noting where is your light coming from? What's the angle of light? How many different light sources are there? And then the second thing that we need to be aware of is where are we placing ourselves, i.e. the camera, in relation to that artwork? Those two very basic principles. So within this image here, we can see that I have a light source here, and we also have a light source behind the camera as well. And both of these combined create a really lovely even spread of light over the artwork. One thing that can happen when looking at our different light sources, if we get rid of one of them, particularly the one from behind the camera, then we get what we call side lighting, and that would then create a very bright part of the artwork here, but then it would slowly peter off into shadow. And we don't want to have that because obviously we're introducing new tones into Van Gogh's painting, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't be too happy about that. When photographing outside, it's important that you are photographing on a cloudy day. Ideally, you really should have a bright place inside, and as much as I know we all hate as artists white walls, it is most ideal in this circumstance. White walls diffuse the light and reflect it around the room, making it lighter and brighter. But if worst comes to worst and you can't find any bright space in the house, then photographing on a cloudy day outside is fine as well. Again, we just want to be making sure that the light is evenly spread across our artwork. Okay, so photographing framed works, and this is also why it's important to note where are our light sources coming from and also where are we positioning ourselves within positioning ourselves in relation to the artwork, I should say. So we can see on the image on the left there, we have a really bad reflection of the window in the background. We can also see my leg and a very brief outline of my head. Again, we really don't want this because there is no window in Van Gogh's painting. So if I play the video here, what we can do, again, it's important, and I will emphasize this, it is important to really just experiment with where those light sources are and where your artwork is being angled in relation to yourself and to those light sources. But if worst comes to worst and we can't find any kind of place, we can see I've started really close up to the artwork, then I've moved myself back, and then I'm actually able to zoom on my camera. So the same principles, I'm using an iPhone here, but the same principles apply to Androids. If everyone kind of looks at my little webcam here, if we just look, we can, oh God, it's like camera in camera. If you just rest 2 fingers on your screen and then you just, oh, I want to be on my face. If we just move our fingers away from each other, then we can see that it zooms in, and if we want to zoom out again, we just bring them back like this. If you're new to this kind of arrangement, then feel free to just take your time and experiment. It's the best thing to do. But making sure though that whenever we zoom on our phone, what tends to happen is we actually have a lower resolution the more we zoom in. So we can see in the end of the video there, the little circle here. It should never go beyond more than halfway when you're zooming in, because as I said, the more you zoom in, the lower the resolution becomes. It becomes quite grainy, kind of like static in the actual camera, and it creates a lower quality image when you photograph it. Typically, when we look at DSLR cameras, lenses do this for us, and they figured out a way to make sure that the resolution doesn't get disturbed the more we zoom in or out. But on our smartphone, typically this doesn't occur quite as much. I do have an older phone model, so for your iPhone X's and that kind of generation, you're much better off. But of course, you don't need to go out and buy a whole new phone just to get this. So make sure, as I said, to first start by looking at where you are in relation to your artwork. As we can see in this video here, I'll play it again. I start off really close to the artwork, and that's creating too much glare. So again, I'm moving myself back, and I'm using zoom on my iPhone, and it's very similar with Android, as I said before, to then get rid of that glare whilst also creating an accurate representation of Van Gogh's work. Okay. So I actually had to, quite ironically, very coincidental, over the weekend, actually had to test this out myself, and I received my own prints finally after 3 months, and I had to put all of this into play as well. So this is me with my own artwork. So we can see that there is a really big reflection of the door in the image. This is particularly so for images which are darker in colour. It's a lot more, it's a lot easier for darker colours to reflect. We can see too that I'm in quite a bright and open space. I think I ended up photographing this in the kitchen, but it did take a good 2 days over the weekend to actually try and position the work in a way that had the least amount of reflection and also created an even spread of work. So we can see my legs there. So even when I'm changing the angle, so there's a light source coming from the left. That's me pointing. And then behind me, I also have a very large window. So what I've done is I've actually put the blind down on that window, so that again, we're not getting any reflection of that window in the physical work. I'm using my DSLR camera for this particular demonstration. But again, the same principles apply when we look at smartphone use as well. So we can also see that I've actually maneuvered myself back. So again, it's usually if you pull yourself back from the work and then you're zooming in whichever camera you're using, that tends to work a lot better. And we can see that I have quite a thick border around my frame. This just means it's easier later on when we're editing to crop the image. I will say that some exceptions when looking at frames in the image, or not to include them. If you are selling a particular print which you would like the frame to be a part of that, then of course you would include the frame, because that's what your client will be receiving. But again, if the frame isn't important, then you should just be keeping to the actual image itself. So again, just making sure that we have a really thick border around our work, and depending on whether you want to include the frame or not, then it's really easy to just crop it later on. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, pre-recorded Mollie. Okay, so just a summary for two-dimensional works here. This image is the perfect image. So if we're still confused about what exactly the perfect image should look like when submitting to the Arts Trail, to a grant application, for posting online, for your website, etc., this is it. So again, we're photographing straight on. There's no warped angles, although it's very hard to tell because Van Gogh is a master of perspective in this particular work. But essentially, all those weird angles, the weird distortion of objects, so the shapes, the forms, the lines, the colours, it's all accurately represented. This is what Van Gogh's bedroom, his work looks like. And so because of that, I'm accurately representing the physical work in its digital form. Light spread evenly across the work, very important. It is also all photographed with natural light, which has been diffused, and it's also been photographed in indirect natural light. Colours are accurately represented in the photograph. There is no blurring or pixelation. So again, I haven't zoomed in far enough, so then it starts to become really grainy and of very low quality. And also I've kept my camera steady, meaning that there's no blurring going on. There's no glares or reflections from glass, and again, no frame is being shown, only the artwork. And again, if you want to include the frame because you are wanting to sell that particular work with the frame, then absolutely include it. However, most of the time you should just be photographing only the artwork. Okay, photographing three-dimensional works. So thank you for all of you sculptors who are watching this. It's going to be slightly more difficult for you, I'm not going to lie. Three-dimensional works are hard because essentially, and I will bring out my little lady, you can see her here, the same sculpture represented in that photograph on the right there. The thing is with three-dimensional works is you have a three-dimensional object, which when you then photograph, the camera makes it two-dimensional. And so what we need to do is create the illusion of three-dimensionality. And we do this particularly through light, which of course is, as I've been saying, the fundamental element of photography. So when we're looking at two-dimensional work, we're looking at just natural light, which still applies. You should only be using natural light when photographing 2D works. That was because we were mainly focusing on colour, shape, line, tone, etc. But when we get into three-dimensional works, the most important element is contrast. The human eye loves contrast, loves it. And because of this, we need to be emphasising our sculpture so that it is true to material. So whatever material you're using, whether it's metal, glass, paper mache, etc., we need to be complementing those materials when photographing our work. It's really important when looking at contrast to note that it replaces what we lose when photographing 3D works. Unlike 3D works, two-dimensional works have a clear outline of where the artwork starts and where it finishes. With three-dimensional works, we're fitting an organic, or typically an organic structure into a photograph's frame, which is typically rectangular. So when we are looking at contrast of our sculpture, we need to be looking at the depth within that image. So my little sculpture here is very dark, it's made of bronze. And because of that, a white background is most ideal. However, if you are using metal, for example, metal is a very industrial type material, and it's also a man-made material. So photographing on black is actually really lovely. It's complements with the black because black is a very harsh shade. It is the darkest shade, as we know. But of course, if you're like Minerva, for example, she sculpts with paper mache, and she always talks to me about how paper mache is a really childlike material to work with. And so because of this, practically we don't want to photograph on white because again, we're not going to get that contrast. We also don't want to be photographing on black though, because black is a really harsh and a lot more mature shade. So photographing on a softer shade of grey, for example, would really complement her works quite nicely. Background colour can make or break the image. So as long as you keep contrast in mind, because again, we're wanting to emphasise form, shape and texture within your sculpture, then that's what we want to aim for. That's what matters. Another thing though that can make or break an image, particularly when photographing 3D works, is light again. I know that we're all getting sick of me talking about light. But essentially with 3D works, as long as you have two light sources that are both of natural light origin, that's kind of your base level when introducing light into your sculpture. What we can do though, and this is only if you're absolutely comfortable with doing this, we can add secondary light in the form of a smaller artificial light source. When we're looking at this from a photography perspective, our two light sources from our windows, they're what we would call fill light. And essentially it means that we have a lovely even spread of light in the background coming from the window on the left, and behind the camera we have a light source which adds another fill light, and again highlighting the background, but also just a lovely even spread of light on the sculpture. If we're wanting to add artificial light, it should be a much smaller light. So I've used a desk lamp in this case. As long as you can angle the light, and again, it should be more of a focal light to add in those details. So ideally, you should have light sources which are of natural light origin. However, if you do want to introduce artificial light, then please do so. And I'm just going to very briefly show kind of the principles of light. So I've just got my little phone torch here, just kind of for demonstration purposes. It's very lovely. But we can see that if I bring my light source really close to my sculpture here, we get a really fast drop off of light. So it's like a really stark light on her right side. Then it quickly turns into shadow here. And so what we can do is actually move the light source away from us. This is just mainly basic principles of how light works. So essentially the further away your light source is, the bigger it is, and therefore the more even the light is spread across your work. And we can see that it's a far more attractive looking light. So the same principles apply when looking at our secondary light sources. We can see the two comparisons. So the image on the left is using only natural light, and then the image on the right is introducing that artificial light source. One of the things with the kind of benefits with artificial light when introducing it is you can kind of see on the image on the right that it does actually almost bring the sculpture forward. It makes it pop out and separate it even more from the background, whilst the natural light it has a more flat light, makes it almost look matte. Of course, though, one of the things we can see is an issue when looking at the image on the right, where we've introduced the artificial light, is that now we have two different colours of light being introduced to the background, and we'll get back to this when we get into our editing. So to summarise, just making sure that when photographing 3D artworks, you remain true to material. Always photograph on a neutral background, preferably white, but as I said, there are exceptions to this. Your two main light sources should be from natural light. And again, this is another importance as to why we need to be making sure we acknowledge where our light sources are coming from, and also too, where we're positioning ourselves in relation to our artwork. If you do wish to use artificial light, make sure that you're placing it away from the sculpture, just enough that it doesn't cast too harsh a shadow in the background and also on your sculpture, as I demonstrated before, but that it just creates those small little highlights that natural light might not be able to get, particularly if you have a smaller sculpture. This becomes really important. And again, when photographing your sculpture, remember that contrast, texture and form are everything. So remaining true to material and seeing how well we can contrast between the background and the sculpture. So finally, we get on to editing. This is the last little bit before I take any questions from you all. We can see the before and after. The thing with editing is, we've done all of this in-camera processing. So that is everything to do with position of our artwork, it's everything to do with lighting. All of those in-camera processes that happen need to be complemented, and I emphasize the word complemented, with the editing component, because often what can happen is we can over edit. I would recommend using just bringing your physical work in front of you and then just editing as you're looking at your work to make sure that you're remaining true to the physical work, because again, we want it to be an accurate representation of the physical work in the digital format. So if I just play this video, this is just done on my iPhone. I'm just going through all the different lighting adjustments, so brilliance, exposure, shadow, highlight. I'm sure we've all had a little taster of this. This is just found under the Photos app if you're using an iPhone, and very similarly for an Android. You can also get filters on within that kind of the photo editing app. Don't use those because they will just add colors that you don't need in your artwork. So again, just going through all the different lighting adjustments and using them, and you'll see shortly that I quickly try and address the two different colors of light happening in the work. So you can see here, I'm cooling down, I'm introducing more blue to contrast with that more orange light that was in the before shot. Down the bottom on the right, we can see the little square icon with the two little arrows. That's our cropping tool. So what we can do is we can then crop to, if we're looking at two-dimensional work, to crop to just the artwork so that it doesn't show the frame, or if you're wanting to the frame, we can crop to that as well. It also has an option to adjust the work slightly as well. So if you have photographed it so the frame is like on a slight angle, then you can actually adjust that and bring it to a more linear perspective. So again, just making sure that when we're editing, that we are complementing all the in-camera processes that we've done. You shouldn't be relying on editing to get you past the line, because what can happen, and this is the same when looking at DSLR cameras as well, the more you edit a photo, the lower the resolution of that image becomes as well. So that pretty much ends my presentation, everyone. Thank you very much for listening, and I shall hand it back over to Stacey.
Thanks, Molly. That was awesome. What a fantastic presentation tonight. I've already had a couple of comments come through our social media about what a great job you've done. So thank you so much for that. And I think everyone will sort of feel the same. So if anyone has any questions for Molly, please send them through to the chat. And I don't know if you can see it, Molly, if you brought up the chat in your...
Yeah, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen.
So I think there's a lovely couple of thank yous there. And Helen has actually asked something. I've seen people often using two identical artificial lights on stands set up in front but to the side. What are your thoughts about this? And which globes are better to use?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, I've used this type of setup in a photographic studio myself. I mainly was looking at natural light because I know that there will be people who, are kind of at that level, just to make it easier. If you do want to use those two artificial lights on a stand, you can use them. I wouldn't be using them with a smartphone though. That's the only thing. Only because for example, a DSLR camera, it's a lot easier to change the white balance because they actually have particular controls. whilst on a phone, when you're looking at the photo editing abilities of your smartphone, it's a lot less so and a lot less accurate. Any artificial light that you add in can also create grain. And so on a DSLR, we have what's known as ISO, which allows us to reduce the amount of noise and grain in that particular photograph, whilst our smartphone doesn't have this. If you're comfortable with using them, then yes, but honestly, it's really not necessary to have that if you don't feel comfortable using them. So yeah.
Thank you, Mollie. And I think Catherine also asked about when is the right time to use HDR on your iPhone.
HDR. Sorry, Kathy, you've lost me on the acronyms there. I'm trying to think.
It's the high res option, I think.
Okay. See, that's my bad. See, I have an old iPhone, so
I was going to say, I think that's your phone.
Yeah, that's my phone. I have heard about it though. I mean, every time they reinvent these different phones, they have a better resolution to them. They always focus a lot on the camera because we're all so in social media land most of the time. So, I mean, again, I wouldn't be relying on your camera's technical components. Again, you should really be focusing on where is the position of my light in relation to the artwork, and then where is your camera in relation to your artwork. So yeah, more so relying on that rather than any kind of technical function. But yeah, thanks, Kathy.
And there's also another question about black dot. Although I'm trying, what does black dot do in the edit options on your phone? I think that's one of those.
Yeah, this is it could be like the red dot. Is that what you're meaning?
I've never seen that. That was Mary Ellen.
Okay. Well, Mary Ellen, I mean, I think if it's the red dot usually gets rid of, to say you're photographed on a flash and, people get those red alien eyes, it actually gets rid of that. But you shouldn't have to worry about using the red dot. Just mainly focus on lighting adjustments when you're editing. But yeah, I hope that's what you meant.
Well, if that isn't what Mary Ellen meant, I think we'll get her to just type something else in. And Sandra asks, is the copyright automatic when I post an image on Facebook or Instagram of my original work or photos?
Yeah. Every single situation doesn't even have to be posted online at all. Essentially, as soon as you create that work and you've, whether it's unfinished or finished, you own that work. So you will always own copyright to your image no matter what the situation, whether you're posting online or just storing it in the back shed or something, So yeah, you're always owning it. That's fine.
And Mary Ellen's gotten back to us and said she has a black dot option amongst the saturation, contrast, etc. options. So yeah, maybe that's something that we'll just have to we'll look.
Maybe that's something on the new iPhone that I just don't have.
We'll do some research into that, and maybe if you wanted to zoom back in at the tea station this Friday, we can answer you.
Yes, I'll answer that. But I mean, as I said, kind of in that little bit about editing, and this could just be because I'm quite an experimental artist. The best way to really learn your phone is to actually experiment with that option. So yeah, just experiment yourself. But I'm curious to know what that's about as well. So I'll get back to that.
And Sandra's asked, does editing on Lightroom or Photoshop reduce the resolution, or is this just the phone?
I'm assuming that you have Lightroom and Photoshop. It does, depending though on whether, this is where it gets really, really complicated. If you're photographing in RAW, then you can do undisruptive editing. But if you're photographing in JPEG form, then yes, it will be destructive editing, meaning that it will take information out of the photograph and reduce the resolution. I actually have my camera here, Stace, but I might show this just so everyone knows what I'm talking about. So we can see, well, hopefully everyone can see, I'm really hoping that this works. Hang on, I'm trying to get rid of the resolution. I hope everyone can see this. There's a little option here called RAW, and you can change that in your touchscreen settings on your DSLR. So always photograph in RAW and that's only if you know how to operate Photoshop or Lightroom. Yeah. So yeah, predominantly yes, it is destructive, and it can lower the resolution when using Lightroom or Photoshop. It's very complex.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be learned. And like, let's just say that Mollie's done a lot of study in photography. So
3.5.
And yes, that's been a long time, so it's probably not something we can cover in an hour tonight, but anyway. Kay has done some Googling for us. Thanks, Kay. And she has said that black dot enhances the black in the image, creating greater contrast. So that makes sense. She does have a question on hints of photographing book covers.
Photographing book covers. And I don't know, like if we, I mean, I'm assuming we would be able to, but and I don't know how you would want this to be presented, Stacey, but always like having the book standing upright and photographing it like a three-dimensional sculpture is always best. And then if you want to photograph just the cover itself, then you can have maybe 2 images showcasing that. Particularly on your website if you're wanting to sell the book. It's always quite nice to do. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. Something fit for purpose. I guess you'd be taking framing a photo of just the cover in certain circumstances. You know, tossing up different art options or whatever for the front of the front cover, as opposed to selling your work or promoting it. Or just popping something up on social media. So I would recommend in those circumstances to have a look at what a lot of other peers or people that you admire within your particular genre are doing, and you know, use those as a good basis for how to go about it.
Yeah. And so I think predominantly because it is a three-dimensional object. And also one thing you can do, because it's often with traditional sculptures, I mean, it's they're typically very decorative, although this isn't always the case. And so if, to say, you're a ceramicist and you're making cuts and things, it's quite nice to actually kind of, for example, angle your object in a certain way that it then kind of makes it look like someone could literally reach into the photograph, pick it up and use it, because those kind of things have both an aesthetic appeal but also a practical appeal, if that makes sense.
Great.
Brilliant.
Thank you. That's great.
Oh, no worries, Kay.
So we might actually finish early tonight, it looks like.
Yeah. Woohoo. Brilliant.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm happy if people want to, and let me know your thoughts, Stacey. If people want to know more about maybe like the photoshopping part or just more DSLR type things, I can discuss that in more detail on Friday. But that's
if anyone has like fairly, and that was what the teach stations have been set up for, to ask fairly specific questions, you know, that relate to your own practice, then that would be a great format to do that in. So yeah, for sure.
No worries. All right.
Okay, well, yeah, and on that note, the tea station, you should have the link to that in your original acknowledgement of registration, but I will also be sending that link out again tomorrow. And Mollie, if you're happy, I will, you can send me through a PDF version of your presentation, and I'll send that out to everyone as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have recorded this session. We're going to make a video of it and pop it up on the Surf Coast Shire website, Surf Coast Shire YouTube page, and our surfcoastartstrail.com.au website. So you can review that later at your leisure, or you can refer any of your creative friends to it if they missed tonight's presentation. So once again, thanks heaps, Mollie. And yeah, and if anyone wants to get on board for the rest of the workshops for June, there's still plenty available with some really great content coming up. So take advantage of the freeness of this and sign up. So thanks everyone, and thank you to Mollie. So yeah, we'll hopefully see you at another session later.